First of all, welcome and thanks for taking the time out to join us for this launch event for our new DAO-backed community, Collective Intention, which we've created to support the responsible development of the psychedelic therapy sector. Beginnings are really important, and we're really grateful for your support by being here. My name is Jenkins, and I'm the founder of OEV Partners, a consultancy that focuses on raising awareness, increasing acceptance, and ensuring equitable access to psychedelic therapies. I'll be kicking off this event with a brief introduction to psychedelic therapy, collective intention, and its objectives, and how we plan to achieve these goals. And then we'll move over to our lineup of excellent panelists who will discuss some of the key issues facing the sector in more detail, before concluding with next steps and how you can become involved in the community and the DAO. First of all, a disclaimer. I'm going to make some statements which are my opinion, but which I think the evidence supports. Time is limited, so I won't go into the evidence now, but I would be happy to debate further afterwards. Language is important too, as is imagery, as words are how we see ourselves and our stories in our own and others' minds. Language is changing rapidly as we learn the impact of our words on others, both positive and negative. This is especially true with some of the subject matter I'll cover, but words are often used innocently without awareness, so I'm happy to become better informed on that as well. We've got a lot to get through, so we won't be taking questions in the session. So for these and anything else you want to discuss, we'll be sharing a link to the Discord server at the end of the session, and we encourage everyone to join. Discord is a group chatting platform that is used for many kinds of communities. Often people come to this sector with a personal story for themselves or others close to them that acts as a motivation. For myself, as an adoptive parent, I've had an in-person crash course over the last few years on the effects of early life trauma. When you recognize it and the behaviors it drives, you start to see the impacts everywhere. That essential sense of being loved and being lovable and feeling safe and secure, where that is absent or unreliable, can have such lifelong impacts for the person and beyond that are so fundamental that they really aren't treatable with current conventional psychiatry, especially as up until recently has been focused on diagnosing or labeling disorders. As we'll hear during our panel discussion, traumatic experiences have effects not just in the mind and the brain, but also deep in the body that current popular therapeutic models don't address. The definition of trauma is also something up for debate, and it's a valid subject for another discussion. I'm not suggesting that all mental health struggles are driven by childhood trauma, just that a significant portion of them look like they are, and this is where psychedelics come in, and that's my motivation to act in this sector. Psychedelics, and I use that term in the broad sense that includes MDMA, ecstasy, ketamine, and classic psychedelics such as LSD, psilocybin, ayahuasca, DMT, and beyond, are increasingly better understood and now finding serious application in mental health and wellness. The key driver of this renaissance is a growing understanding of the mechanism of action and the potential of psychedelics coupled with therapy to address mental health issues and help people develop new models and modes of thinking about themselves and others. We're still learning. It's not a magic bullet. It doesn't always work for everyone. We're still figuring out a lot about which therapeutic approaches work best. But it does appear to be at least as good as the best antidepressants and without the numbing effect that these offer. Plenty of companies have emerged to drive this change. Funding for research has come from governments in, amongst others, the UK and Australia. Clinical trials are increasing rapidly with the range of conditions targeted getting wider. So if the science is in hand, governments are backing it, and companies are up and running developing treatments, why can't we just sit back and let it play out and everyone will get the help they need? Despite the recent strong progress, the future for psychedelic therapy is crowded with hurdles and uncertainty. There are many different potential trajectories, both positive and negative. Just some of the potential negative outcomes are Low awareness leading to lack of demand and uptake, making the sector unsustainable. Limited acceptance due to scare stories, stigma amongst patients and doctors. Inequitable access as a result of inadequate funding and or restricted awareness. Increased harm caused by inadequate focus on therapy and or abuse of power by therapists. Limited research because of restrictive pricing or intellectual property practices by corporate interests. Conversely, responsible development of the sector can vastly improve the probability of positive outcomes, such as the establishment of a positive regulatory framework, accelerated implementation, widespread access and acceptance, well-regulated and participant-focused practice, service delivery focused on outcomes rather than cash for therapy, health-based approach rather than criminal justice-led, recognition, restitution, and restoration of Indigenous communities and environments. Each of these subjects in themselves deserve further discussion, and we'll definitely be focusing on this as collective intention builds, and we'll organise further sessions to consider these and other friction, failure, or success points. It's this variety of potential outcomes and risk of negative outcomes that convinced us of the need to act from a grassroots level and steer away from the less than ideal towards the best possible at a sector level. That's why we created collective intention. For the positive outcomes to be achieved requires significant changes across society in feeling, thinking, and outcome. As an example, people need to feel differently about themselves, others, and psychedelics. Because although the stigma is receding, there is still a strong emotional memory based on outdated concepts and stories. Trauma awareness needs to increase across society so that people themselves are aware of the impact on them, can seek help rather than suffering and blaming themselves for what's happened. It's important to build new emotional associations, so when people think psychedelics, they should think medicine first and not drug. Achieving this will require partnerships, collaborations, conscious recognition and acknowledgement of weakness, deficiencies and problems within the sector. The depth, breadth and diversity of the community will be its strength. And this can be achieved by expanding beyond the base into all groups that can benefit or play a role in driving success. Regularly stopping to take a different perspective, one might say a psychedelic view, where we step out of our default mode networks, look in overview at what is happening and why, and consider each actor's position and motivation in a compassionate way, to see what's needed to progress or improve. Then take a deep breath, deep focus on an area of attention to understand what action is required. So why collective intention? A fundamentally new way of looking at thinking and looking at things, such as the successful and wide-ranging implementation of the psychedelic therapy sector, requires a broad coalition of people with different views, skills, and perspectives. To have awareness of the state of different parts of the sector, up-to-date understanding of best practices or thinking, but with shared intention to ensure that as many are helped as possible, and that the sector develops responsibly and equitably. One of the roles of collective intention will be to identify, amplify, and support people and projects who can make this possible. There are initiatives already underway that we can support, such as Freedom to Operate, which is mounting a legal challenge to potentially monopolistic and exclusionary actors in the sector. Drug Science, which is working to positively influence legislation, among many other things, and PsyPAN, which advocates for participant-focused clinical trial and service design. The truth is that there's so much here that we can do to help both short and long-term efforts from individuals to the industry scale. We can raise awareness and understanding of issues such as trauma, addiction, and depression, the psychedelic therapy sector and its potential benefits and limitations. We can support harm reduction efforts and organisations who protect and advise people if they choose to take psychedelics in unregulated or underground settings. We can influence policy towards an outcome-based model of mental health treatment delivery that allows reward based on what happens after treatment rather than cash on delivery. We can support research into diversity in clinical trials and the sector and what's needed to engage harder to reach groups. We can support responsible and equitable development of the sector by supporting efforts to prevent corporate interests from monopolising important patents and other IP. And at least in the UK, even if treatments are approved, where's the funding coming from? Can we make a better case for mental health funding by showing increased efficacy or emphasising the damage done by lack of treatment? These are just a few examples. There will be more that will emerge as we grow and connect. And in all of this, it's as much about supporting and connecting to existing actors as it is about building from the ground up. So why a DAO? Power of networks, the internet and blockchain technology today enables us to bring together a community that is dispersed and global and empower it to act. Decentralized autonomous organization, DAO, is an entity with no central leadership. Decisions get made from the bottom up, governed by a community organization organized around a specific set of rules enforced on a blockchain. DAOs are internet native organizations, collectively owned and managed by their members. They have built-in treasuries that are only accessible with the approval of their members. Decisions are made via proposals the group votes on during a specified period. A DAO is a tool that can help support communities who want to act together to achieve certain aims. It's democratic, proposals have to be agreed by a majority, it's non-hierarchical in that there is no management or leadership team. Crucially, they offer full transparency. Any member can see exactly what proposals are agreed and how resources are being dispersed. Discourse and debate takes place on a social media platform, in our case Discord, to refine and look for consensus before proposals are brought to a vote. There is some technology to learn for sure, and for sure we'll be providing information and guidance on this as we create the DAO and ask people to join. And anyone who follows the crypto market will know that at least in some areas, there is a lot of uncertainty and volatility, but we believe this is a key technology that will increasingly underpin organizations in the future. We want to emphasize that collective intention is a community first, not just a DAO. You can join collective intention because you want to listen, debate, offer opinion, share insight, discuss theory, and many other things. Joining the DAO is not compulsory. Of course, with funding, we will achieve more, but we start by first building the community. Ultimately, we do want it to be about action and driving change in the sector and beyond to push towards the positive outcomes and steer away from the negative. And if you're considering what role you might play in the community, there are many. Thinker, funder, activist, creator, philanthropist, researcher, moderator, technology specialist, general supporter, policy expert, sector expert, and more. The truth is that when we act collectively and with intent, we can achieve a lot, and there's a lot we can be doing. Okay, thank you. And we'll just hand over to the panel now for the discussion.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, thank you very much, Chris, for that introduction. And I'm Neil Woods, I'm from Leap UK. Thank you everybody for attending today, all you wonderful people out there. And I'm going to first ask questions of Ian and Leonie from PsyPAN. Now, Leonie, I've heard you speak a few times and you're always fascinating, but I think today, I don't think I've heard Ian speak. So I'm going to start with Ian, if you'll forgive me. So Ian, please, could you tell us, I mean, we've just heard from Chris, his motivations, and I always find that very interesting from Chris, what actually brought him to this space. So what brought you to this and what is the mission of PsyPAN?
So the short answer is lived experience of depression and anxiety, really, is ultimately what's led us both to this point. Having received various treatments, medications, therapies, and, you know, with very limited impact on my depression. So I won't speak for Leonie, I'll speak for myself. But so having become increasingly desperate and working myself into, I just burned out through work. In about 2014, I was desperately scrabbling around looking for something to help me, trying to find something on the internet, trying out different things, nothing was working. Then came across a video with Robin Carhart-Harris speaking about the fact that Imperial College were going to look at the effect of psilocybin on depression. So got in touch with the team, and to cut a long story short, managed to get onto the Imperial College pilot study. So very lucky, it was one of 20 people to get onto that pilot study. And it's still the treatment, that was in 2015, it's still the treatment that's had the greatest impact on my depression. And ever since then, probably within a few months, started advocacy work effectively. So started doing interviews to try and destigmatize and normalize these treatments. Also with mental health in general, because there's still stigma attached to that. Let's not forget, we're fighting stigma on a variety of levels here. So walk that path of doing interviews and doing panels and that sort of thing, just trying to kind of move away from that 60s narrative of these crazy out there drugs that drive you insane, basically, was the narrative. Very lucky again to take part. The effects of the psilocybin lasted for about 3 to 6 months, waited another 4 years to take part in another trial, and was lucky again to get onto the Compass Pathways trial. And that didn't have the instantaneous lifting of my depression and anxiety, but it still set me on another therapeutic path, which was more body than mind based, in line with Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, if anyone knows that. And throughout been doing advocacy work. So it was when both Leonie and I were involved in Ros Watt's connectedness program at the Synthesis Institute. That's where we met, and it's a fantastic program that Ros is now rolling out as ACER integration. And we got talking. Ros mentioned that I was looking to get into this area and was already in this area but wanted to do more, and Leonie was in exactly the same position, wanted to do more, be more involved, kind of make it more of our purpose, so that's when we decided to join forces, and we've been doing this probably since about August, September last year. So we're still quite a new organization, but the reaction has been fantastic so far. Lots of people saying, we needed this to happen, we needed an organization like this, we were thinking of trying to set something up ourselves like it. So, there's a definite need for it. And it's just really the natural continuation of the work we were already doing. Our mission ultimately is to help as many people access these treatments safely as possible. That's the overall mission. I don't know, Leonie, if you've got anything to add to that at all.
Well, just let me say, just that before we move on, thank you to both of you, really, because, I mean, you've taken the decision and made the effort to actually publicly challenge the stigma, and that's a brave thing to do, and it's appreciated by all of us, I think, in this space. Now, you mentioned that you've been involved in more than one trial, and you mentioned the Compass trial, and you got something different from it. Well, you've been looking at how we should do this. So, Leonie, feel free to, of course, add anything to what Ian's just said, but also, would you please perhaps tell us what do you think good looks like in this space? How should it be done? Oh, she's muted.
Thank you. Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself there for a second. Could you just repeat that for me, Neil? I was so worried about unmuting myself there.
Yes, certainly. Do feel free to add anything to what Ian's just said, but also Ian made reference to different trials and different ways of doing this. What do you think, from PsyPAN's perspective, what do you think, what does good look like? How should this be done?
So So from our perspective, I mean, as with Ian, I've had a long history with depression, and I've had the good fortune as well to be accepted onto 2 separate trials. Mine was the second imperial trial, psilocybin trial for depression. And then more recently, I was fortunate enough to be accepted onto the DMT trial being run by Small Pharma. And what's been interesting in the conversations with Ian is comparing our experiences across these 4 different trials, how they've been run, and again, how we've responded to the medicines and the treatments. And there's certainly things that are coming out across all 4 trials, which are what we think will be best practices in this field going forward. And there's certainly things that might be specific to each trial, how it was run, that we'd like to improve. And then also looking at our different responses, to psilocybin itself, repeated doses. And then for me personally, comparing it to DMT, which is obviously, while a psychedelic, quite different in terms of its intensity and its duration. And so for us, I think that the common theme across all 4 trials and what good would look like is to not lose the importance of integration support and preparation. I think all the trials have done really quite well in trying to do the setting on the day, spending some time with your guide, your psychotherapist, as well as the lead psychiatrist on the trial. So I think all the trials have done really well on the clinical therapeutic side and on the day. But I think there's a real risk that gets watered down in trying to roll out these treatments and to make them more cost efficient. And even with the trials, there's not enough, there could still be more integration. I think Ian and I have tremendously benefited from being part of Ros Watts's connectedness program, and that ran for a year. You know, it's not a handful of calls that happen, or even in-person meetings after a trial, that will help you. It is about, and the difference is those are the calls with you just one-on-one. But I think the difference with Ros's program, and which has been incredibly healing both for Ian and I personally and professionally, is meeting others who are doing the same work and on the same path and on the same process. Otherwise, you are just yourself. I think depression is an illness of disconnection and isolation. So then you are having had this profound experience and you're isolated, alone, trying to find your feet, trying to integrate these lessons, trying to make the small changes. It was only today Ian and I were chatting about the importance of small, regular, daily changes. It's not these, go have a treatment and come out and resign from your job, divorce your wife, emigrate to a different country. That's not the changes we're looking at. It's the small incremental changes where after 2 months you are in a different place. And that's how you sustain these, the long-lasting benefits of these treatments. So I think Ian would agree and probably add more about the importance of integration in this. And I'd also emphasize the importance of from thinking about the participants' experience right from the recruitment stage, how you start dealing with people. I mean, both Ian and I have had quite harrowing recruitment experiences on some of the trials. And it's, I think a lot of people drop out. They don't even continue through the recruitment process. And that's where it starts. Care starts from the very first call, the very first customer participant contact. It's not just on the day with the great clinical team. So I think the importance of starting right at the beginning, how you mean to go on.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it brings it back to a point that Chris was making in his opening speech. I think that we need to be focusing on outcomes rather than financial imperatives. And you just used the word cost effective, and of course, there's always going to be big pressure on this sector for cost effectiveness if we look at it purely through a business lens. So do you think that this approach of collective intention, being a collective, is in some way a defense against that development? I'll ask you first, Ian, but I'll definitely want your opinion on this as well afterwards, Leonie, please.
Sorry, the creation of collective intention can be a defense against.
Well, can it be a defense against the business imperative, the drive to make this about making money first rather than the outcome?
Yes, I mean that's the whole. I mean, it's the reason we exist as a network is because there's strength in numbers. We can pool experiences, we can pool our knowledge, and I see that reflected completely in collective intention as well. That's the purpose: bring people together, strength in numbers, and just really try to steer this sector in the right ethical direction. There are some people doing a lot of good work that do have participant interests at the very heart of everything they do, But then we've all heard the numbers. We've all heard how much some of these, you know, companies that have floated on the stock exchanges are worth already. And the main fear, I think, is that if certain key companies make huge mistakes, that could derail the whole sector. And that could mean that these therapies remain inaccessible for who knows, another 50 years, you know, and that's really what we need to guard against. So I think it's a different approach, you know, it's I would say in a broader sense, it's a psychedelic approach. It is a connected approach. It's about collaboration, not competition. And that's really where we need to head if we are going to try and balance out this, you know, the dash for cash, basically.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's actually would you say, Leonie, it's a very new way of looking at things. Has your therapy, your successful experiences, has that changed the way you approach something like this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think personally, I don't think we can come with a solution to the problems we face as a society, as communities, with the same level of thinking. I think there was an Einstein quote along those lines. You can't solve problems with the level of thinking you went in to create them. So for me, I really think psychedelics and a psychedelic frame of mind and approach really is the way to sort of tackle these problems. So even the way Ian and I work within PsyPAN, I think we do things really, really differently. Where we work very collaboratively. There isn't hierarchy. The way we work with participants within the network, very inclusive, and I think that's the way it needs to be. Sort of the way people conduct their businesses, conduct their methods of working, and the treatments that they deliver will have to be fundamentally different. It isn't replacing one pill with another pill, and not changing the way we do things. I think psychedelics call for a deep-rooted change in every single possible way.
And building communities like this and like PsyPAN itself. Yeah, that's key, absolutely key. Yeah. Excellent,
thank you both. I'm now going to move on to Liam Farquar from Brighter Pathways. Now, Liam, I'm very fascinated to hear from you, because Chris has told me about you and some of your thinking. And speaking as somebody who I'm diagnosed with chronic PTSD, so I'm very interested in some aspects of the way you see this. And I understand that you see that there are very physical elements to psychological issues and trauma. And certainly from my experience, if I'm experiencing a very negative PTSD experience, it's very physical. It's very physical. So I think I know where you're coming from there. But just as a way of introduction, please let us know what brought you into this sphere of psychedelics.
Yeah, and hello, and lovely to be here. Yeah, so I'm a legal psychedelic guide. I have training in two new trauma-informed, increasingly popular and effective therapeutic models: internal family systems and somatic experiencing, which is quite a radical approach to dealing with trauma, resolving trauma, releasing trauma. It's the life's work of Peter Levine, who's one of the leading trauma experts in the world. Yeah, so I was a management consultant before getting into this work, and I was a male nanny before that. So it's not been a predictable career. But yeah, similarly, developmental trauma, lots of it, CPTSD, without being aware, I suppose, of the label for most of my life. But yeah, I had chronic insomnia. That was one of my obvious symptoms, chronic insomnia for about 17 years. And I just crashed. I crashed at work, management consulting. I was at one of the big four firms. It's not a very trauma-informed work environment, as aren't many. And yeah, my mind kept telling me, yeah, it told all sorts of stories to keep going. Everyone's miserable, whatever, whatever those parts needed to say to keep me going, they did. And my body had to collapse to finally stop. And then I did something, quite extreme, I suppose. I quit my job, rented out my flat, and went on this multi-year long healing process, retraining process, continued my own therapy. I realized years ago that conventional talk therapy wasn't effective for me. So I used internal family systems and somatic experiencing on myself, which worked. But yeah, did men's group work, spent a lot of time in nature, did trauma release exercises, did breath work, did meditation, did lots of yoga. And then, did all my retraining. So it's quite an intense period. I would not recommend doing that to anybody. But came out the other end and started this work that feels more than a work. It feels like a calling. But essentially I was my own guinea pig. And I did things, things worked for me, and then I started introducing it into my client work. And what Ian was saying, taking a more somatic approach, the work of Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps a Score, extraordinarily popular book it's an academic book on trauma that's been at the top of the New York Times bestseller list for a couple of years now. I think that shows something, that there's something in the collective there, that we're tuning into trauma and what it is really. So I guess that was my path to this work, and happy to discuss how I frame trauma and what a trauma-informed approach to this work is.
Yeah, thank you for that. There's a lot of what you say I recognise there. Certainly not in having the trauma, but not knowing the labels and not really knowing what was going on, because that's something I recognise. I had to have a breakdown first before I knew what was going on. So you talked about the physical element. How does the physical side of things factor in your actual therapy that you carry out?
Yeah, so Peter Levine says overcoming trauma is primarily a physiological process. And I very much agree with that. I guess first let's define what trauma is, right? So that'll add some clarity. It exists across the spectrum, of course, but the simplest way I've come to frame it is that it's the protective response to overwhelm or adversity. So an event or period of time that's too much, too fast, too soon, in which we breach our unique window of tolerance in the autonomic nervous system, and we get stuck in protect mode, right? So what happens when we're overwhelmed as mammals, and we forget that we're mammals, but as mammals, we generate all of this survival energy, this fight or flight energy, protective energy, adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol. And that's designed, we've evolved over millions of years as organisms to generate that in order to fight or flee. Often we can't do that, right? So the next protective response as mammals is to shut down, is to go into freeze. And again, Peter Levine says that, trauma is not the event, it's a response in the nervous system. So I'll do a quick, this may be known to some of you already, but it's worth having a very quick refresher on just what the autonomic nervous system is and does. So the autonomic nervous system includes the sympathetic and the parasympathetic branch. It runs from the brain stem all the way down to the genitals, connecting to most of our major organs on the way. The parasympathetic has two branches, again, brain stem to the heart, and then one that runs down to the genitals. And that's the ventral vagal and the dorsal vagal. So ideally, we want to be spending as much time as we can in the ventral vagal. It's literally a heart-centered place of self, right? It ends at the heart. When we're in that nervous system state, we feel calm, connected, social, curious, things like that, right? So what happens when we get activated when there's stress? We go into the sympathetic branch, the fight or flight branch. And if that goes on long enough, and when we're in that branch, again, we're excreting cortisol, noradrenaline, adrenaline. And if that goes on too long, then we enter the dorsal vagal, the shutdown, the disconnection, the freeze, and that's designed to conserve energy. What trauma is, and we're constantly oscillating between these systems, right? We're safe, we feel connected, something stresses us, we go into the sympathetic, maybe it goes on long enough, we go into the dorsal vagal, but then we come back to the ventral. That happens, you know, stress isn't trauma. Trauma is when it's too much, too fast, too soon, and we get stuck in protect mode. And in order to unstick ourselves, that's not a rational process. It's not a thinking, talking process. You can't, in fact, access trauma through the rational mind. It's an automatic process. It's an instinctual process. Again, as mammals. So for me, it looks like shaking and tremoring. That's one way to discharge this energy. Could be deep exhalations as well. Could be purging. Could be yawning even, but shakes and tremors are one of the most obvious ways. And that was the one thing really that helped me get over my chronic insomnia. I had also, you know, years of conventional talk therapy helped me understand some things to a point, but it didn't help me heal. You know, my nervous system was stuck in a state of hyperarousal. So I could distract and numb myself during the day with work, with alcohol, with whatever it was. But at night, it was just me and my nervous system, and there's no escaping that. So when we discharge this energy, our nervous system regulates. And really increasingly, this is, I think, for me, the cutting edge of healing, of therapeutics, and why Peter Levine's work is so revolutionary in some respects, is we're seeing that the root of a lot of our issues is due to nervous system dysregulation. You know, we could say anxiety, really anxiety is a state of stuckness in the sympathetic, high arousal, hyperarousal, racing minds, inability to be present, insomnia, anxiety, things like that. And really we could say depression, as Leonie said, is, you know, it is a disease of loneliness and isolation. I agree with that. It's also a response in the nervous system as well. It's a getting stuck in that dorsal vagal, hypo-aroused state of like freeze, stuckness. It's all the fun D words: depression, dissociation, detachment, you know, things like that. So yeah, we really need to heal as mammals, because it affects our stories, right? If we're just staying at the narrative level, that's important, right? Like we need to reframe our stories. We need to update our life scripts. That's an essential part of any healing process. But if that's all we're doing, we're not acknowledging the somatic side of things. So yeah, I think like primarily we need to discharge this, because, you know, our nervous system state affects our stories. You can say like sensations become stories. You know, we're stuck in a state of like hyperarousal, for example. Situations, people, ideas even might seem unsafe, even though that we're safe in the present. So, you know, we can reframe our stories as much as we like, but if we don't feel safe, we're not going to be safe, and that's how we'll move through the world.
That's really fascinating, and thank you for that explanation, Liam. But you say reframing, and well, that brings us to a very important core issue, and where I think the next panelist is going to help us out. So I'm going to now speak to David Krejci. I hope I pronounced that right, David, from Media Forensics. Now, David, I'm an activist, so I'm constantly thinking about how we present what we do to the media and what those risks are. And listening to Liam there, it makes complete sense to me, because I've been following this. I've done a lot of the same reading. I do my best to understand these in these terms, but not everybody in the public listening to Liam talk about that will be won over. So we need to consider who's listening and how we talk about this to different audiences. So I'm very pleased that you're here to perhaps unpick this. But first of all, will you just tell us a little bit about your background and what brought you to this?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks. Welcome, everybody. I'm bringing about 25 years of experience in communications, public relations. I call it communications because it's matured beyond that simpler term of public relations. 22 of those years were at a global PR firm, one of the largest, if not the largest in the world. So I did work across all industries, from pharma to health insurance to consumer products, B2B, every imaginable type of client, which was great in the sense that it, gave me the broadest perspective on how communications works. And so I was there for 22 years, ultimately got laid off 6 weeks before the pandemic, which I don't advise you to get laid off right before a global pandemic. It makes things a little more challenging. Spent about 6 to 9 months pretending that I was a rock star and that I was still getting my severance and I could go and make music in my basement and not have to worry about money coming in. So my lifelong dream was lived for that 9 months. But in that time, I was also thinking about what, of course, I want to do with my career and my experience moving forward. And I made the decision to start my own consultancy focused on crisis communications, which was what I was doing about the last 12 years at the agency I was with. But I bring a special, I mean, crisis communications is a very distinct subset of public relations, as you can imagine. But I like to think I brought even a wrinkle to that, in that I brought in the insistence on understanding social media and how that contributes to crisis communications, because any crisis you see in communications today either starts or propagates or is accelerated by or is perpetuated by social media. So you cannot stop a crisis or a miscommunication issue or sentiment without addressing social media. And for whatever reason, crisis communications largely kind of avoid social because they don't necessarily take it seriously. And conversely, on the social media side, the people managing their Facebook, corporate Facebook pages, Twitter pages, and so forth, often are not thinking in terms of crisis and what can go wrong. So I have the pretense of saying I'm the bridge between those two. So that's a little bit about myself. Was your second half of the question about like what brings me to the psychedelic sector, I assume? Right.
Yes.
There are 3 reasons in thinking about that. The number one might be a little boring to the rest of you, but it literally is the most fascinating communications challenge that I can conceive of. And I've worked on some really amazing ones. Largely because, this is a nascent sector trying to get on its feet in its infancy, trying to get legal, all of the things that you already know. So that's fun and exciting. But the more compelling part of it to me is the disparate communities that are interested and supportive of this industry, but oftentimes have conflicting messages and conflicting goals. So we've already mentioned some of them, whether it's the people coming in to try to make a quick buck versus the people that are coming in to, legitimately try to get their clinical trials published. And on the scientific side, then you have the people that just want a free party drug so that they can have a great time at the club. And then you have the people who are legitimately, as therapists, trying to improve upon their therapies and make people healthier. All of these people, ultimately, if you put it on the dotted line, what's your goal? We want psychedelics to be helping people with mental health issues, right? But it's a very different proposition when you're really just trying to make money, as we said earlier, or you're really trying to promote X, Y, or Z. So as I'm looking at this communications landscape, it's really problematic because I'll be reading through my Twitter feed or Instagram or whatever else, largely just to see how people are talking about this. And man, it's dramatic. You'll have one guy saying, man, I'm smoking DMT on the bus right now and everybody turned to aliens, but I sure love it. And then the next one, you'll have a doctor talking about how important it is to do legitimate and thorough research before we get into this. And then I'll call a person in the pharma industry saying, what's your take on the psychedelic industry? Are you guys threatened, whatever? And, well, as soon as we can figure out how to monetize it, we're going to monetize it. But until that point, the industry is a little bit problematic for the pharma, big pharma, as it were, industry, for all the reasons that you can imagine. Someone taking Prozac for 40 years is a lot better customer than someone who goes to 3 sessions of psilocybin treatment and then hopefully is, again, quotes, air quotes, cured. So the reason, not the most important reason, is definitely that me as a professional who loves and is obsessed by how news and information gets spread to my fellow humans. It's really just an amazing, thing for me to focus on. So that's one reason I like it. Number 2, I don't know that this is worth anything other than to me, but in my 20s in a touring rock band, let's just say I had a lot of recreational experience with those particular drugs. And that by no means makes me an expert in any way other than to say, I understand what it feels like to be under the influence of those particular chemicals. And I never used them to party. I always used them just to listen to music because music sounds a whole lot better. And, you know, all my life, I brought that with me. There's this book where someone explains it like you only need to do it once, in the same way that if somebody showed you the moon for the first time, you don't really need to see the moon a second time. You know it's there, and all the magic that you suddenly were exposed to, like, you mean there's this big rock that's flying around our planet and changing the oceanic waves, and looks beautiful sometimes and is bright orange sometimes and big, and other times is small. If you've gone through this experience, you know what I mean? Like, you only need to do it once to say, oh, I get it now. But if you've done it 0 times, trying to imagine what the moon looks like or what it is, there would be no chance, right? So that's the second reason. Like, I feel like I can legitimately talk to the experience. As soon as I had my child, I stopped doing that. Not because I'm some sort of perfect parent, more about I don't want to have a bad trip, and because I now suddenly have this responsibility of another human being, and I don't want to mess it up. And I know that my brain could have gone there, if you know what I'm saying. And then the third one, I just realized that lots of my family's behind me. I'd say about 50% of those people behind me have suffered from addiction or anxiety, myself included on a couple examples. And seeing, as we all do, having either your own personal experience or someone that you love go through these experiences. In my own case, particularly with alcohol, it was such a horrific, painful experience that I have no words to articulate what it was like to go through it and then, undo that. And then all the stigma and everything that comes with it following that is certainly important to me, but also my mother suffers from mental health issues, and other people in my family have anxiety and addiction issues. So when unfortunately, it sometimes takes seeing it firsthand or experiencing it firsthand to get you to act or to move. Such is the case, and that's why I'm here. And I mean this when I say it. I spent 22 years doing work that I really loved in most regards, but helping companies sell tennis shoes is not the same as helping a company cure someone's PTSD or addiction or anxiety issues. And so I'm lucky enough to, be at the stage in my life where I can kind of choose to say, all right, I'm going to choose this industry at its earliest stages. It's going to be tough financially, perhaps for years as things get going. But I would rather do that and go through that than just go back to another agency and do that kind of work.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you for that. And thank you to all the panelists, really, for being involved in this. And I suppose, I need to move on to the other David quite shortly, David, but just briefly, if you'd be so kind as to just point out where, you've mentioned big pharma, people who might lose money by alternative treatments, but where do you think the attacks are coming from, and what are they going to look like?
I think the attacks are going to come from all over the place because of the reason that I said before. Like, you're going to have one group arguing that this is amoral and that's what bad people do, they take drugs, Another group is going to say there's not been enough research done. It might be great, but the number of trials and et cetera, and excuse my ignorance on the right language for that, but like, it's not sufficiently researched in order for me to be taking it. But pharma, why I bring up pharma, and I'm not intentionally criticizing pharma, I'm just warning everyone, I guess, that, they have 8 or 9 digit marketing budgets, and they are able to, this collective thing that we're doing is fantastic, but up against a $20 million budget, it's going to struggle, right? And so I think some of my larger concerns, or actually my largest concern, of the attacks are going to come from what we're doing wrong, and I mean that in the big we, in our own messaging. And I'm really not trying to criticize one organization. I'm not going to name them, but you're probably going to know what I'm talking about. There's a large organization right now with a founder who has said a few things out there in the industry, and it's gone awry, right? And those are bad enough, whether it's terms about Indigenous people that Indigenous people certainly would not like, or comments about sexual assault that is not going to go over well with most people, or the idea of, giving medication to Ukrainian refugees as a quasi-clinical trial. Despite the intentions behind perhaps those statements being good, what he is doing is creating fodder for anybody that wants to bring us down. because all of those things are in quotes in the media, all of those things are on video, and it's just as simple as sharing those stories in order to undermine everything we're doing. I can't remember which one of you guys said it, but it was the exact point I'm trying to make, is that one person or two people can bring all of us down. And so if a larger contributor to our own conversation is saying the wrong things or doing the wrong things, again, it can be used against us. For example, if I were at pharma and let's say I wanted to combat the psychedelic industry, it would be as simple as taking those comments and those videos, hiring 20 influencers on Instagram that don't like psychedelics and say, hey, check out these videos, go for it. And suddenly you have thousands and thousands of people seeing this message by people that are their influencers. And the worst part of it is most of the people in our industry are not following TikTok. They're not following Facebook, Instagram. And so there's a consensus, or there's a belief that we don't like that's being built up based upon incomplete information. And we're not even aware because we're not monitoring or listening to those channels.
Right. That's a very important warning, David. And I suppose it emphasizes the importance of this collective. And the fact that we need message discipline within a collective, but growth will potentially be very important here. I mean, look at the Borg. No one can stop the Borg, can they? And I make no apologies for a Star Trek reference. I physically couldn't stop myself. But I think, so if anyone out there is listening to this and thinking, well, what can I do to safeguard and help safeguard what we do, is, well, help grow it, I suppose. So thank you, David, very much for that. I'm going to move on to the other David Hoppe from Gamma Law. Now, this is something I don't know much about, David. I at least was able to have some informed questions with the other people, but you're going to be telling us about the DAO, which Chris talked about when he introduced this. So please, would you be so kind as to, for a simpleton like me, what is the DAO, and how does it help this collective?
Sure, thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to be part of this important discussion. It's something that I really hope that that we can move forward, and achieve some traction and achieve some the objective of increasing awareness and so forth. So, with respect to a DAO is a decentralized autonomous organization. It's unlike anything in terms of legal entities that's ever come before, in part because it's not a legal entity, at least at its core. What we're talking about is a community that that is formed using a blockchain network. And how that works is individuals purchase tokens generally, or they earn, or they are gifted tokens. And those tokens, and of course, there's all sorts of complexities that could be associated with this, but fundamentally, we're talking about individuals owning tokens held in their crypto wallets. And by virtue of ownership of that token or tokens, they're entitled to some input, some voting rights, generally called governance rights for this autonomous organization. And, the types of DAOs that we've seen to date, have ranged from investment funds, essentially, which are just informally kind of put together and are funded through individuals purchasing their governance tokens, which therefore serve the dual purpose of both allocating governance rights to this organization and also a funding mechanism through which people pay into this organization's treasury. And just to follow with that example, how a DAO works, once we have the members and the members have their tokens and they have their voting rights, in the simplest case, in an investment organization, the DAO could say, the DAO, the members, let's say, of the DAO, a consensus could build through their communications platform they use. Maybe it's Discord. that says, you know, we should cause the DAO to invest in, you know, this particular sector or this particular company. And a formal proposal is made through the voting mechanism of the DAO, which typically is essentially what's called a smart contract. It's a fully automated means by which individual owners of the governance tokens can submit proposals that that are then presented and considered by the entire membership of the DAO. So what we're talking about fundamentally is an organization that does not have a centralized management, just like any other legal entity, essentially, that we've seen throughout history. It's an organization where, in its purest form, it's a complete democracy, with individual voting rights, you know, usually based on, you know, the investment that individuals have made to acquire the governance tokens. But, you know, in theory, it could also be made just on the basis of, you know, one person, one vote, one wallet, one vote. So I guess, you know, to try to bring this sort of overall legal description of what a DAO is, to bring it here to relevance to this discussion, I think we're talking about, you know, an opportunity for people to receive or acquire these ownership tokens in this DAO, which would be formed for the purposes of advancing public awareness of psychedelic therapies and the benefits, and perhaps having some influence on policymaking, and you know, perhaps and you know, the organizers can speak more to the details of what's contemplated, but perhaps there's an arrangement under which, you know, individuals can contribute funds to help support these projects, and perhaps the individuals that choose to contribute more are allowed a greater voice in the organization by virtue of having more tokens. And proposals are made to the organization. We should fund this particular initiative. We should fund this particular startup, perhaps, that's developed some new approach or some new technology to advance this cause. And the entire membership of the DAO then has the opportunity to vote on these proposals. And those that achieve a majority or whatever the threshold is, then are the recipients of those funds.
Okay, so, well, there's something that really appeals to me about this from the way you described it to me, and that is the fact that in this democratic way, it facilitates communication by people who are a member of it. And that communication would seem to me to be a good way of communicating the kind of information that the previous David was talking about. So in terms of developing strategy, message discipline, even internal education and internal comms, it seems to be an effective way of doing that as a sort of community consciousness. Am I seeing that in the right way? Is that something that perhaps other sectors have benefited in that way?
So I think, you know, communications among DAO members would take place on a third-party platform like Discord, as I mentioned, or perhaps another platform. Maybe there's some kind of a message group that's private to the DAO members. But fundamentally, I think, to your point, rather than simply having, you know, kind of a random channel on a social media platform, you have individuals who have committed in some way to this cause, to this organization, and they're, you know, owners essentially. So perhaps that results in a higher quality of discourse and higher value, you know, that comes out of those communications.
Yeah. Okay. Now, a lot of people are learning or think that they're learning about blockchain and cryptocurrencies, for example. Are there any risks of a DAO?
Well, there are risks, of course, as with any type of organization in which, you know, people invest time or money or other resources. In the case of a DAO, we do have the kind of overarching concern about, you know, ambiguity as to how it will be interpreted with respect to taxation and with respect to legal liability risks. in different jurisdictions. So I'm a US lawyer. From a US perspective, if a DAO is not incorporated or formed as an LLC or other type of legal a limited liability entity, then you do have a concern that the default treatment under US law will be a general partnership. In a general partnership, each individual partner is theoretically responsible for the entirety of the debts of the partnership if partnership funds are not sufficient and there's a lawsuit or there's a tax requirement or some other issue arises. So the major DAOs have developed ways to deal with this. There is some movement in the legal space in the United States to allow DAOs to establish themselves as limited liability companies, let's say, in order to limit the liability of individual members of the DAO. So that's one issue is liability, another is taxes. Again, in the general partnership context, then each individual member is responsible for paying their proportionate share of tax on the income of the organization. And of course, the organization may or may not actually disclose its income, or perhaps any income that it earns, perhaps through sale of NFTs or other activities, may be held in its treasury and not actually distributed to the members. So in that case, the members would not have a way to pay their taxes. So it's sort of the two significant risks. And, again, there are ways to deal with this that, some are quite simple. The DAO organization has thrived in a number of sectors, and a number of organizations have been, have achieved, tens of thousands of members. But those are sort of the principal concerns, and others could include, who are the individuals that have formed this DAO? Are they, what's their backgrounds? What seems to be their objectives? What happens if they lose interest or leave? Is there a concern that a certain a critical mass of members with illicit objectives might be able to achieve a majority voting stake in the DAO and therefore divert resources to their own objectives or for whatever purpose? These are sort of the principal concerns of DAOs.
I suppose those risks are really mitigated by who's involved, and I think it's been stated by somebody else on the panel earlier on. I can't remember who said this, but that this is we're taking a psychedelic approach. So it would seem that as long as the right approach is taken, it could be managed within the collective. That's everything from me, I think. So I think now what I have to do is to hand over back to Chris. Chris?
Hi. Thanks, Neil. I'll start my video. It doesn't look like, but I hope you can hear me all. Okay, so thanks for your hosting, Neil, and Leonie, Ian, Liam, and David. David, for your thought-provoking contributions. Really, really excellent discussion. I really wished we had way more time to dive into each of your sections, because all of you, your contributions are worth at least a session in themselves. They're all fascinating subject areas, and maybe that's something we'll return to. And before we close and jump over to Discord for any questions, I'd just like to thank you for coming along. We really appreciate your time. I'll just let you see my face towards the end. In terms of next steps, we'll be sharing a link to Discord in the chat. I think our collective intention should be doing that now, so you can join the Discord. If you can't join the Discord right now, I think as David talked about, it's the main platform for discussion and coordination that goes ahead of the DAO. And really, we're using it as our main community platform. And as you might have guessed, our DAO hasn't actually been created yet, because we wanted to create the community first, and then we can start to talk about the governance, how we operate it, who joins, and that will allow us to build the DAO in a way that will work for us. But again, as I said, the community can can achieve a lot even without the DAO, because a lot of it is about connecting, sharing, amplifying. And this session, if you like, is a kind of snapshot of what we mean by collective intention. We brought all these different voices that have different roles in the sector to see what we can achieve together and to share information and views and try and give us things to think about and points that we can discuss and share with others that we encounter. So as I said, we'll close the discussion in a minute. We'll pop it over the Discord. If you can't join now, then the Discord channel will remain open once you've joined, and the chat, you'll be able to see the history of the chat. And our panelists will stay around, I hope, for around 30 minutes afterwards. But any questions that you post that after they've left, we'll take them up and we'll seek them out and feedback answers. We'll also be sending an email follow-up in the coming days with more details on our future plans. And finally, we'll be uploading a link to the video of the session to our website. So please feel free to share and invite others to join or spread the word about our community or any future events. That's it. Thanks again for all of you for joining us, and we hope to see you over at the Collective Intention Discord. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks all.